There we go. Hey, everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm so thrilled to have you joining us for our ongoing virtual author event series, which we have been doing for about 16 months. And we've had the great privilege and pleasure of hosting well over 160 plus author events in that time and talked to a lot of amazing people, talk about a lot of great books. And it's been a great way to stay connected with all of you too in this strange time. And keep a tether to our audience, but also reach a lot of new people. I know we have a lot of people watching tonight from outside of Oklahoma, maybe even outside the country, all over the country. Thank you for joining us. It really means a lot to us that you would spend some time with us. And if you'd like to know more about everything coming up, we're going to keep doing this virtual thing for a little while, but we are slowly transitioning into some real in-person human beings with human beings kind of events later this month. You can see that on our website. One thing of note I will mention, if you're in our area on July 13th next week, we're going to be doing an actual in-person event with the United States Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, which should be a really wonderful conversation. That'll be at All Souls Unitarian Church here in Tulsa. So you can get tickets for that at our website, magiccitybooks.com. Don't miss that if you have the chance to see it. Tonight's event, really excited for tonight's event. Also because I get to be an audience member like you and watch two great writers in conversation, which is always a pleasure and always a thrill. Our moderator for tonight, I first got to meet virtually last fall when we did a event for a wonderful novel called The Water Dancer. If you have not read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, The Water Dancer, I would certainly encourage you to do so. And that was a conversation we had where Ta-Nehisi was in conversation with Damon Lindelof, the creator of Watchmen. And it was a really wonderful event. Got to meet both of these gentlemen virtually and actually got to bring Damon Lindelof to Tulsa a few weeks ago for the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre with the writer Cord Jefferson, who joined us as well. And we had an in-person event here in the Greenwood district, just a couple of blocks from our bookstore. And that was a great way. So without that event, we probably wouldn't have had that either. So I want to say a big welcome and thank you to our moderator for this evening, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And also our guest of honor, who has just dropped on the New York Times bestseller list, I believe as of today, longtime writer for The Atlantic and creator of an article from 2018 that I think will go down as one of the signature pieces, thought pieces of this era that we live in. I think the cruelty is the point is a phrase that will go down much like, you know, it's the economy stupid or follow the money in our history of political discourse as something that defines an era. And I was so thrilled to see that the piece that Adam wrote for The Atlantic was being expanded and going a little bit deeper into what he had to say about this strange era that we are living in. So Adam and Ta-Nehisi are going to be in conversation for about 40-45 minutes. I would encourage you all to ask some questions in the Q&A and we'll pull some of those at the end as well and get to some of those questions. So please put those in there. And if you need more copies of this book, all of you, thank you all for buying a copy of the book. Everyone who's watching got a copy of The Cruelty is the Point. But if you need some more for your friends and your family and your coworkers who need to have tough conversations, you can get a bunch of those there at that link in the chat. And we'll keep dropping that in there. So thank you all for watching and a big thank you to Mr. Ta-Nehisi Coates and our guest, Adam Serwer, and I will turn it over to you gentlemen to begin the conversation.
Well, thank you guys for having me back this time in a role that's actually probably a little bit more comfortable as a moderator. It is my astute and complete, and I don't have enough adjectives and superlatives to describe it, but I guess I'll just stop and saying it's my honor to be here with Adam, who's a good friend of mine, a writer I admire and look up to. In addition to that, and now a New York Times bestseller. Congratulations, Adam. It's not a small thing. I want to divide this conversation into two parts. I want to talk about the implications of Adam's book, the political implications of Adam's book, because I think there are many, and I think that they're profound, and I think there are implications that we don't usually like to think about. And I want to talk about the possibilities of political solutions, or whether they even are political solutions to begin with. And then I want to talk about Adam as a writer, because I sometimes people see something like "the cruelty is the point," phrase like that, and that phrase went everywhere. And I'll talk to Adam about how he felt about that. But what people don't realize is when Adam came up with that, he was doing the essential job of a writer, which is to distill, to clarify. Folks see something happening out in the world and they're not quite sure how to give language to it. And in those short words, Adam gave us language for what we were actually seeing during the Trump era. So Adam, if I could, I'd just like to start reading a very short excerpt from the centerpiece of this book. The cruelty is the point. It is not just that the perpetrators of this cruelty enjoy it, it is that they enjoy it with one another. Their shared laughter at the suffering of others is an adhesive that binds them to one another and to Trump. Taking joy in that suffering is more human than most would like to admit. Somewhere on the wide spectrum between adolescent teasing and the smiling white men and the lynching photographs are the Trump supporters, whose community is built by rejoicing in the anguish of those who they see as unlike them, who have found in their shared cruelty an answer to the loneliness and atomization of modern life. It is that cruelty and the delight it brings them that binds Trump's most ardent supporters to him in shared scorn for those they hate and fear, immigrants, Black voters, feminists, and treasonous white men who empathize with any of those who would steal their birthright. The president's ability to execute that cruelty through word and deed makes them euphoric. It makes them feel good. It makes them feel proud. It makes them feel happy. It makes them feel united. And as long as he makes them feel that way, they will let him get away with anything, no matter what it costs them. So I think those words, stinging and clarifying and cold as they are, offer a challenge to, I would say, contemporary liberal discourse, and maybe even broader than that, about what happens in a polity. And I think there's, a line running through this book that talks that the traditional notion, and we saw this with economic anxiety, and then I'm gonna shut up and ask the question, was I think there was some comfort in the idea that if you could just reward people with things, if you could make the government quote unquote work or function, in the daily lives of Americans, voters would see that would reduce racism, bigotry, sexism, etc. What you are arguing in this book, really, and in your work, and in that, as I said, in that centerpiece, is that no, that's not actually correct. They enjoy the cruelty. The cruelty is not a byproduct. It's the point. And so, obviously, that kind of breaks existing political notions of how you address things. And so, Adam, I wonder what we do when you have a portion of your populace, of your electorate, that is not there for the social programs, that would indeed forego the social programs if it meant somebody else being punished. Where cruelty is actually an ideal, a flag in which they unite around. What is someone who wishes to see a democracy that responds to a broad electorate supposed to do? How do you forge a country out of that?
Well, thank you, Ta-Nehisi, for that kind introduction. I think that what I'm talking about really goes back to the founding of the country. You have a country where you say all are created equal, but you sever a tremendous amount of the people from the country to that ideal. So, white men with, it really applies to white men with property. It doesn't apply to Black people. It doesn't apply to the enslaved. It doesn't really apply to women as they meant it at the time. And so to justify that, you have to come up with reasons for why that, these blessings that you say are the right of all humanity, why a certain segment of humanity is not entitled to them. And this is a battle that we've been fighting as a country since the founding. We fought it during Reconstruction, we fought it during the Civil Rights Movement, and every year in between. And I think if you understand that America's fragile experiment with multiracial democracy only really started in earnest in 1965, then it becomes much more understandable that it is as vulnerable as it is to this kind of ideology, which after all, long predates Trump. um, you know, basically, what we have is a situation where the structure of our system allows one party to hold power without winning a majority of the votes, um, because of the ideal geographic distribution of that group of people. And so the party that represents that group, it becomes even more urgent for them to persuade them that they are sort of on the verge of annihilation. Their way of life is about to be destroyed. And you can see this with Donald Trump in his rhetoric. He says, I'm the one who's going to protect you from everything. I'm going to protect you from what the liberals are going to do when they gain power, which is take everything away from you that matters to you. And that's how you end up justifying things like disenfranchising rival constituencies, how you justify trying to violently overthrow an election. It's all tied to this idea that there is a legitimate group, there's a group in America that has the legitimate right to permanent political and cultural hegemony in the United States. And anything that threatens that is a threat to the country that as it is meant to be. Trump didn't invent that. He didn't come up with it. It's as old as the country itself, but he was a talented practitioner of that kind of politics because he watched Fox News every day and repeated what he saw on Fox News back to these audiences, thus validating the things that they had come to believe were responsible for all the problems in their life. So it's not simply, to say that economic struggle creates racism is wrong, because your struggle is mediated through ideology. It's not, you don't simply come to conclusions. It's not like we're not robots. You don't type in a program and and you have a particular reaction. What happens is your misfortunes, your problems are mediated through the things, the values that you have and what you have come to believe about the way that the world works. Now, what's interesting, I suppose, is that Trumpism never really commanded a majority. And again, it's reliant on the counter-majoritarian levers of American democracy in order to remain viable. And that offers a kind of solution, which is that you have to make the system, which was designed to be unfair in many ways, to be more fair. You have to make structural alterations to that system, because the only way that parties really the only way they really change is by responding to differences in their ability to hold power. And we know this because you can look at the Democratic Party, which was once the most white supremacist organization in American life. And when in 1932, beginning in 1932, when Black voters in the North began to become part of the New Deal coalition, that coalition, the labor unions, urban liberals, Black voters, they changed the course of this party, which up until then was the party of racial apartheid in the South. And that is tremendously powerful. It also offers a path forward, and it tells you how you ultimately defeat this kind of politics, which is you have to make it less rewarding. As long as they can win power doing the stuff that they're doing right now, they're going to do it. As long as they can alter the rules to diminish the influence of voters that they consider illegitimate, not truly American, they will continue to pursue that path. And that's, on the one hand, that's sort of dark. On the other hand, this is probably the first time in American history that the coalition that opposes that ideology is as big as it is. It wasn't this big during Reconstruction. It wasn't this big in 1968 when Richard Nixon, in the midst of the backlash to the civil rights movement, won that election and then subsequently won re-election. That was a genuine majority. You know what I mean? Like Richard Nixon was not representing a ideally geographically distributed minority of American voters. He actually had, most Americans were on his side. And Trump never really had most Americans on his side. So I think that's a kind of, in some ways, that's a kind of thing that's something that's sort of hopeful. On the other hand, as long as this system enhances the political influence of the most conservative elements of the electorate, there's no reason for the Republican Party to change course from where it's going right now.
Yeah, it's like you go into a football game and you spot the other team 10 points every time.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right.
So
What's interesting?
go ahead, Adam. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say what's interesting is the fact that their power is actually artificially enhanced by the structure of our system. For some reason, they don't process that as because of this ideology where they consider themselves to be the only legitimate inheritors of the American tradition. They don't see that as an unearned advantage or as the unearned advantage that it is. They, in fact, see the other side as somehow taking advantage of things that they are not entitled to. When it's really that they are, their power is enhanced beyond what it should actually be in a more democratic system.
So I just want to, and then I want to get back to the book, but I just want to play this out as you suggested. What you seem to be pointing to is the idea that there needs to be, literal, democratic reforms. There needs to be, one would, look at DC statehood. One would look at how the Senate is apportioned. One would look at redistricting. All the things that you said that basically advantage the audience for this kind of cruelty. You have a political situation though where Ezra Klein argues the thing that disciplines the Democratic Party is actually its diversity.
That's right.
And that's a good thing. But part of that diversity is Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin.
Right. That's right.
So how do you even, what is the prognosis, not to turn you into too much of a pundit, but if you have a party that feeds off of that cruelty, has an unearned advantage from it, and then you have another party that can't really unite in opposition or in defense of democracy, thus far at least, where does that leave you long term? To say nothing of the entrenched advantage of judges, for instance, also.
So the Democratic Party represents the majority, but it does not have the unity of purpose that comes with being a smaller party. And the Republican Party does not represent a majority, but because of its homogeneity, racially, religiously, ideologically, it has a unity of purpose that the Democratic Party doesn't have. And I think, I don't know really what the answer is to Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema is, because, during Reconstruction, Republicans were not, they were not ardent believers in racial equality. There were a couple of people who were, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, but in general, the party was often on the defensive saying, oh, political rights does not mean, you have to serve a Black person in your establishment, or you have to let a Black person marry your daughter. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about social equality. And, but they came to understand, people think of the 14th and 15th Amendments as, these great, most of us do anyway, as these great accomplishments, but they were both partisan and ideological accomplishments. The Republican Party had an ideological interest in defending the Black vote because the Republican Party was not viable in the South without the Black vote. And, the Democratic Party is in a similar position today, to the extent that, this is one of the reasons why Manchin's objection to sort of partisan voting protections was sort of ridiculous, because that's how we got the 14th and 15th Amendments. And if you are willing to cede veto power to people to a 6-3 court that is willing to write the 15th Amendment out of existence when it comes to the rights of Black voters, and a party that simply sees its interest in continuing to restrict the electorate so that it does not have to be responsive to a more diverse group of voters. At some point you have to decide. You have to decide whether the decorum of the Senate is more important than the fundamental rights of your constituents.
Yeah.
The Democrats can't do that. I don't know that Republican voting restrictions will succeed in insulating their power from the electorate. That's certainly what they're trying to do, but I don't know that that will actually work. What I will say is that if it does work, it's less likely that Republican Party dominance lasts forever than Democrats will have to move considerably to the right to compete in an artificially conservative electorate that actually does not reflect the majority of the country. And I think, that is going to have tremendous cost. I mean, when this happened in the 1870s, it had tremendous costs for Black people in particular, because when you know, the whole point of a democracy is that politicians are responsible to the people. And when you can take a certain group of people and make it so that you no longer have to be responsible to them because you're disenfranchised, then that opens them up to being mistreated and their rights not being respected. And so if we get to that point with these restrictions, and again, I'm not sure that they're going to work, that's a very dangerous thing for the vulnerable constituencies on which the Democratic Party currently relies for power, and on whom, and these constituencies are reliant on the Democratic Party to defend their rights. So I don't want to make any predictions because I just don't know what's going to happen. But I do think it's a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah. In one of these pieces in here, you went out. Adam is not just a commenter. The thing I love about Adam, one of the things I love about Adam's also a reporter. In one of these pieces, I believe early actually on, maybe when Trump was running, you actually went out and did some reporting out in the field. And so one of the things that I kept wondering, I hope that you might address here is, you talk about, again, in that centerpiece essay, this idea that we underestimate the appeal of cruelty. We underestimate, like, it's not something we talk about. Like, you sit back and you watch, some pundits analyze why a certain candidate did well. No one says, none of the pundits say, well, it was because, Ted Cruz was particularly cruel tonight. It's not a particularly common answer. So it's not a way that we like to think about ourselves. But I wonder whether you yourself have thought much about what the appeal of cruelty actually is, and not just among Americans, but to groups of people that, in polity. I think, if you look at, Orban, for instance, you can see cruelty, certainly in how he's campaigning. When you look at Le Pen, you can see, and to some extent Macron, you can see, the usage of cruelty to appeal to people. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about what the target group, not the target of the cruelty, but I guess the target of the message actually gets out of that.
I think it makes them feel as though they belong. It makes them feel powerful. And it makes them feel above the people who are being acted upon. So, I mean, the sort of depoliticized version of this that I give people is like, if you've ever been a child, you've seen like the cool kids try to make fun of the nerdy kid. And maybe, maybe you join in because you want to be part of the cool kid group. Or maybe you are one of the rare few who stick up for the kid who's getting picked on. Or maybe you simply stay silent because you don't want to be the next target. And the cool kids who are teasing the nerdy kid, they have formed a kind of community through that act of both transgression. They're doing something that they're not supposed to be doing. And they have, bonded with each other over their shared cruelty towards this person on the outside. And so what it does is it creates an us and a them and justifies what the us does to the them. And it's not, all human beings are capable of this kind of cruelty. I try to emphasize this is not something that is just about conservatives or just about the Republican Party. I can remember, when I was sitting in my house in Texas during the freeze, I'm like going through social media and I can see these, I'm scrolling and I can see these tweets from people who are like, oh, well, that's what you get for voting for Abbott. Shouldn't have voted for Abbott. And for me, that was, look, that kind of cruelty, the distinction between that and what you see at the Trump level is that the Democratic Party, by virtue of its diversity, cannot behave that way towards the opposition. So when California was having rolling blackouts, Ted Cruz was on Twitter talking about California is a failed state. When Texas was having its blackout in the middle of the worst winter storm in 10 years, the governor of California was like, best wishes to Texas, we'll help however we can. That's not because
Right.
Democrats are more virtuous. It's not because liberals are better people inherently. It is because when you are reliant on a diverse coalition, you will try to win people over rather than demonizing them. And that, we can look at that through history. We can see when the Democratic Party was in that position and was behaving with these sort of rituals of cruelty in order to create hard lines between their community and the one that they wanted to exploit. And now we see that the Republican Party is in a similar position and is behaving with that kind of contempt towards human beings who are outside of its coalition. So I don't think, this is an essential part of human nature. And the only way to prevent it from dominating politics is to have a system that diminishes the rewards for engaging in it.
I always thought of like catcalling as like kind of an example of this, wherein men forge community through dominance of public space.
That's a great example.
Yeah, like they're almost talking to each other as much as they're, making an example of it.
It's almost not really, they don't think that woman is going to respond. They are
that's not
asserting
the
their power over her by humiliating her and then, showing their boys that they're, they're the kind of person who could do this.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a great example.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that Trump was so like Trump did not like recently become racist? It's marked his career since his entrance really into the public consciousness, from being sued for housing discrimination by the Justice Department, yes, up through, calling for the death penalty for the Central Park Five, through birtherism, through, stuff in books written about him, et cetera. This is not new. Why do you think it was that so many, and it did, they got to a point where people were, would openly call Trump racist, et cetera. But I guess my question is, why do you think folks have been so resistant to speak to the appeal of that? To speak to that as an actual political force, as you position, as opposed to a side dish?
I think it is implicating. I mean, look, with, white people are the demographic majority in the United States. They also tend to be better off than other demographic groups. So they, as consumers, they hold a lot of power. And for, if you are a mainstream outlet, a mainstream newspaper, news channel, you don't want to alienate a huge section of your audience. And, tens of millions of people voted for this man. So if that's the case, you really don't want to alienate these people. If you're a Democrat, you might need some of them to vote for you. If you're the New York Times, you already have a bunch of liberal readers. You want to get these people who do not currently trust you to listen to you. And if you suggest that racism has something to do with their political choices, you're putting yourself in a position to lose their money, their trust, their viewership, their readership. And I think, I believed at first that because of this sort of market incentive, that it was going to be very hard for people to look this in the eye. And I think what happened was that Donald Trump was so blunt and so repetitive about what he believed and why he believed it and why he did the things he did, that instead of, eventually people just sort of had to accept that this was what it was. Like when you're saying Cory Booker is going to come into the suburbs and threaten the housewives. I mean, like, it's so, like, on the one hand, it's like so old-timey racist, but on the other hand, it's so absurd that it lends itself to someone being like, hey, that's so overt.
Right.
And I think, I think what's interesting is I think there's not a lot of disagreement between me and Donald Trump about what Donald Trump believes and does. There's disagreement about whether that thing is good.
Right.
But there's not a lot of disagreement between us about whether or not his audience enjoys his cruelty towards individuals, whether or not race is a part of his pitch to his voters. I mean, I think he said to the New York Times after he called Kaepernick a son of a bitch, get that son of a bitch off the field. he said, my people love this stuff. He understands exactly what he's doing. And the disagreement, I think, really is not between me and Donald Trump, or Donald Trump and most of his left-wing critics. It is between those critics and the industry of people in between us and Donald Trump who like Donald Trump and want to support him and want to tell themselves that the things that we are describing are not what they are supporting. And so they have to say, oh, he didn't mean it like that. He was he's not a politician. He was unpolished. He was speaking off the cuff. This is a bad faith liberal misinterpretation of what Donald Trump said. They're smearing him. It's fake news. Whatever the rationalization, I think ultimately Donald Trump and his worst critics, his most vociferous critics, are in agreement about what Donald Trump is about. I think the people who want to defend him are the ones who are dissenting from that consensus.
So I want to shift the conversation a little bit. One of the things I love about Adam is that he has great clarity in his writing. As I was talking about that at the top with the title. That really is the job. And Adam, I don't want to get you into too much trouble here, but I certainly know through conversations with you that you have philosophies about how to write. We've talked about this. There's a language, for instance, in terms of activists, and then there's a language that I would say somebody like you, not all writers, but somebody like you that writes, and that's very different. I always like this portion of the conversation because it's never the case that you never have any writers in the audience. Would you talk a little bit about your philosophy of writing, what you're trying to do, and how you do it a little bit?
Yeah. So I would say the past 5 years in particular, there's a book called Black Reconstruction in America by W.B. Du Bois. And in it, he sort of says, at the time that he's writing, the mainstream historical consensus is that Reconstruction was a tragic, failed thing. It was corrupt. It was, quote, Negro tyranny. It was a mistake to enfranchise Black men. And therefore, the Jim Crow system is a moral and justified end to that foolish experiment. And Du Bois writes in his book, he's like, look, this book is for people who think that Black people are people, that they are just as capable, talented, and flawed as other human beings. And if you do not believe this, you will be unable to read and understand this book. And I'm not even trying to convince you if you're that person. What I'm trying to do is write the truth. And for me, I think it is very tempting. And I think there is an idea of opinion journalists in general that our role is to persuade people who don't already agree with us to agree with us. Now, look, it would be nice if that happened, but I don't think that's my job. I think fundamentally my job is actually, similar to objective journalists in the sense that my job is to write what's happening as best I can so that the audience, the public, can make a decision based on, whatever information they get from me, that they feel like is useful. I feel like my job is to put down a record of events that is as close to accurate as I can get it, not to say slant my argument in a way that I think will persuade Trump supporters to see it my way. And I think if you do that, you ultimately end up risking that you will be dishonest in your argument because you want to be persuasive. There's a possibility that your argument becomes corrupted by your desire to appeal to a hypothetical person who does not already agree with you. And whether you agree with me or not, what I am simply trying to do is describe events as accurately as possible. And obviously not everybody feels that way, but I feel like it's important to approach the job that way because it helps me, it gives me a kind of clarity for focusing on what I want to say.
All right, so I'm gonna use that and I'm gonna back up a little bit. So were there a lot of books in your household?
Yes. A lot of books. A lot of books. My parents.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Well, my father worked for the State Department. My mother worked for the Smithsonian. Uh, that valued that kind of learning and knowledge, and were, I mean, I can remember, my parents giving me, children's biographies of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali when I was like 6 years old. And they didn't. It's interesting because they didn't necessarily tell me what to think about those things, but they were clearly trying to shape my understanding of the world. And so, yeah, I grew up in a house with a lot of books, and I was expected to read a lot of books as a child.
Did you enjoy it at the time?
Um, I did, but I much preferred comic books to the books that my parents wanted me to read.
Yes,
Um,
of course.
I was a a tremendous reader of comic books more than anything else, to the point where, if my parents wanted to punish me, they would come into my room and like take all the comic books in my room and like shove them into a box and just take them out and be like, you get these back when you like finish your homework, you
Right,
know?
right. So when does the light switch come on where you think, or what was the first moment where you were like, oh, I think I can do this? Like when you go from reader to writer, like what is the earliest moment you can remember
I started off writing bad poetry on metro buses in Washington, D.C.
that?
And I think, I went to Vassar College, and I majored in English, where I was fortunate enough to have Kiese Lehman, who is a great
Hmm.
novelist and memoirist, as a teacher. And he was, he was a very important force in my life in terms of um, making me think about how to be a writer. Um, and
Did he tell
uh,
you? Did he tell you you could do it? Like, was he the first person to say you can actually do this?
uh, Kiese was he was encouraging, but he was not, he was respectful of whatever it is that you were trying to do with writing. And he would
Mm,
ask questions that were meant to guide you in that direction without telling you, he didn't give you answers. Um,
mm,
because I think his philosophy, and I hope I'm not misstating it, but I think his philosophy was that he wanted to guide you towards the type of writer that you wanted to be, not the
yeah.
writer that he thought you should, or that he might think you should be.
Hmm.
And originally I actually wanted to make documentaries. That was what I went to journalism school for. But I was also blogging on the side, and this is dating myself. Um, but it was 2007, 2008, which was sort of the late blog era in sort of the amateur sense, and that was actually how we met. Which
Right.
was I had been a reader of yours, and I noticed that you had a blog, and you were just trying your hand at blogging. I was like, oh,
Right.
that's Ta-Nehisi Coates. Um, and that's sort of how we originally met, was on the
Hmm.
internet.
Hmm.
So your
Yeah, yeah.
internet friends are real, everybody.
Right. They are. They are.
Or they can be. They can be. But I think, I was blogging, and, I had a decently well regarded blog among certain people. It wasn't like heavily trafficked or anything. But the American Prospect asked me to guest blog for them as I was graduating journalism school, and I couldn't get any jobs in documentary. There are not those jobs are like, in public television or with certain companies, and there are not a lot of them, and they're hard to get. And so I sort of, the American Prospect job seemed very appealing to me because it was a chance to still retain my own political voice. And that's what I find so precious about magazines in general, is that they allow you to see with your eye. And
Mm,
uh, another medium that used to do this, and I only say used to because they tragically are falling by the wayside, but alt weeklies were, of course, like a
yes.
wonderful training ground for this kind.
Hmm.
You're a City Paper alumni.
Right. Right.
Um, you know, Outlets like the Village Voice or the Riverside Times, like these outlets
Hmm.
that encourage you to both report and um, and be open about your personal ideological perspective and views. were like, to me, that was the kind of journalism that really appealed to me. And so I was fortunate to start off at the American Prospect, and was fortunate to come into a magazine that thought of itself as an intellectual project, and still does. It's still a great magazine. And that was sort of it was sort of a crooked path. It was not a very straight, it was not like I woke up one day and I said I wanted to be a journalist, and then I worked for the school paper, and it was sort of accidental. I just sort of tumbled into it. And it turned out to be, a rewarding career for me. And I'm fortunate in that way. I mean, especially considering the state of the industry, it's very, there aren't as many jobs as there used to be, and there are a lot of talented people who don't have them. People who are just as talented as I am, who are just in a different situation. So I feel very grateful to be where I am.
One of the things I think about when you write, and I'll make this the last question because I believe it's about time for our Q&A. One of the things I think about, like when I read your writing, I feel like I'm going to use a word that gets a bad rap, but I actually think it's very, very important. I can feel the emotion, and in a book like this, I can actually feel the anger. I can feel you seething. It's controlled. It's like bubbling in a pot. It's not overflowing. It's not ruining everything. You know what I mean? It's not overdone. But it's there, just kind of bubbling at the appropriate level. And I think what that does is, I teach a writing class up here at NYU, and I always tell my kids that, contrary to what you think, you actually need heart. You actually have to put your heart in something. There has to be some of you. That doesn't mean it has to be a first person piece, but that there has to be a kind of transference, an energy that you feel in yourself that has to, get conducted through your fingers into the keyboard. And I wonder what your rituals are. Do you have to calm down? Obviously we have conversations online about this sort of thing. Or do you write when you're feeling it, or what do you do?
I find exercise to be very focusing. I run a lot. I listen to music. These days I mostly listen to wordless music. So I have a jazz playlist that I often write to that helps me focus. And I have a very weird lo-fi beats playlist that I listen to that is really just for me, and is full of like weird lo-fi remixes of songs that you would not expect to hear beats to. But I find it's best to write in the morning. For me, I think at some point in college, I could just write at any time of the day, and I could sleep at any time of the day, and I could eat at any time of the day. But the older I get, it's harder for me, and so I find a lot of comfort in sort of keeping my rituals predictable, and like having like specific times of the day where I do specific things. But the number one thing that I always have to do is I always have to run. And there's a way in which like the adrenaline from running just really sort of greases the wheels in your brain, and really gets you thinking about what you want to say and how you want to say it.
Do you have to do it before or after, Adam?
Before. I find I'm in a better place after I run than if I try to write beforehand.
Okay, obviously I could be here all day, but Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, so we do have quite a few questions from our audience, so we'll get to a few of those. And I think some of them are directed at both of our guests tonight, so you can take this, whoever would like to jump on that question. But I'd like to begin with a question from one of our viewers named Paul, who says, so apropos with like the Trump announcing lawsuits against the social media companies today, how can social media be held accountable for its collective role in the promotion of cruelty?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. I would say that there's something to the premise. I think social media thrives on conflict, and it has certainly incentivized a particular kind of conflict between people where we are as uncharitable as possible to each other in contesting arguments. I don't know what the solution to that is. I don't, you can't, we have a First Amendment. You can't like force private companies to use algorithms that reward conflict less. I suppose the only way to do that would simply to leave the platforms in the first place, and that's what Ta-Nehisi did. Um, uh, which a decision that I respect and admire. But I think, to the extent that we have the power to change that is by telling the platforms as consumers that that's not what we want.
Yeah. One of our viewers, Laura, says, do you have any recommendations for ways to engage with Trump supporters and hold a mirror to their actions so that they can accurately see their reflection?
Um, I don't think there's like a special way. Like, Trump supporters are people. They're people you disagree with, and so I don't really have. There's no like magic way to get someone who you disagree with to agree with you. You just approach them the way you would approach anybody else you disagree with, and tell them why. To the extent that that is even to the extent that it's appropriate to do that. I mean, I'm not recommending anybody run up and like start arguments with strangers. Unfortunately, the United States is a very dangerous activity. But I really think it's like anything else. I mean, to some extent, disagreement is part of a democracy. The purpose of democracy is to resolve conflicts without bloodshed. It is not to have no conflict at all. We're always going to have political disagreements. There's always going to be people who have conservative views on religion, on immigration, on economics. And I think one thing we should do in general is understand that we are never going to live in a world without disagreement, and we actually would not want to. My objection to Trumpism is not that they disagree with me. It is that their disagreements have led them to a place where they are attempting to change the political system so that they are no longer accountable to the people who disagree with them politically, by severing them from the franchise or diminishing their political power to the extent that they are no longer able to fully participate equally in our political system. We're always going to have disagreement, and democracy is the means to resolve those disagreements. But it can't do that if we don't respect it.
Matthew is asking, this is a question that Adam, you touched on, but I think certainly applies to both of you. It feels like many individuals with comic book reading backgrounds are those speaking and writing with the most moral clarity in the Trump era. Do you have comics that were important to you and helped your moral understanding?
Oh man, this is going to get a little weird. My favorite comic book character is Superman. I love Superman to death. I think that there is
I've been hearing a lot about this.
So much that's, yeah. I think there's so much that's interesting about a character who is as powerful as Superman is, and still decides consciously to use his power in a way to help people, but not to gain dominion over the earth. As and there's Superman is so baffling to people in this way that you see comic book writers constantly trying to reimagine Superman as the evil dictator they assume Superman, someone right. They assume someone with that kind of power would be. But what's interesting about Superman is why he does not make those decisions. And I think just as an artifact of Jewish American culture, he's fascinating. I mean, everything from the destruction of Krypton to the idea of, an alien assimilating into American life through a farm in Kansas, but yet still remaining apart from American society. I think that, comic books are folktales. I mean, and obviously we have American folktales that are not comic books, but I think there is a shared moral universe there that is precious. Obviously, I don't want to. I can understand why some people are saturated by, or are tired of being saturated by its commercial ubiquity. But as a young person, when I was growing up, I found comics to be often a wonderful way to explore moral complexity, and how to be good, even in a situation where you have the ability to not be good at all. And so for that, I mean, I can't speak for anybody else, but that's, that was my attraction to comic books.
Yeah. People don't know this. We're going to spend the last 10 minutes talking about the Snyder cut. So if anybody wants to cut out now, not really. So
I think Ta-Nehisi is contractually prohibited from talking about the Snyder cut. I don't think he's allowed to do that. You're trying to get him in trouble.
No, bad news.
This is a question from Nicholas, who says, how can people who want to help create the structural change you talk about take steps to help? The system as it is can make one feel powerless. Where should we start and put our energy?
Look, I perfectly understand why you would ask this question. I am not the person to answer it. This is a kind of question, whenever people are like, what can the Democrats do or what can liberals do or something like that? I'm not a political strategist. I'm not an activist. I do not know the steps to creating the world, a better or more just world. I can describe the world that we're in and why we're in it. And that's what I feel like my role is. But in terms of changing the world for the better, there are a lot of wonderful, brilliant people who are working on that and who would be better people to address that kind of question to.
The final question is this. We just celebrated Juneteenth around the country. Of course, everyone knows it was just made into a federal holiday, which has been commented on from many different sides. Last year on Juneteenth, here in Tulsa, in the midst of the pandemic was raging, and of course, in the weeks after George Floyd's murder, Trump decided to host his first rally on Juneteenth here in the city of Tulsa, just a few blocks from our shop here, which in and of itself, before they changed it, was a very, to most, cruel act, choosing that day. And of course, there were people.
Is that the one Herman Cain came to?
Yeah, Herman Cain died right after that. And so that moment, and of course, they changed it to the day afterwards. And then Trump said, he helped, no one had heard about Juneteenth until he helped make it famous, all that stuff that happened after that. But that moment of him and his crew choosing that day right on there was a very overt act to me of example of cruelty and using kind of that strategy you talk about. And then, of course, 1 year later, we're in a very different place where the celebration of Juneteenth here in Tulsa 1 year later was a very much different thing. I ask you this. Do you feel like in that 1 year time, you see a lot of progression? Is this an anomaly? Are we feeling like things are getting better quickly? And also that moment specifically, do you see that as kind of an example of the larger kind of Trump team, somewhat subtle way of doing cruel acts on a subversive level? It's a big question, but.
So as long as we're talking about Tulsa, I just want to shout out Viola Ford Fletcher, Hughes Van Ellis, Leslie Benningfield Randall, the remaining survivors of the Tulsa massacre, who of course testified before Congress. Is very precious that we still have their witness to those events to rely on and to learn from. I think that Trump excelled at provocation, not simply as an act of cruelty, but in general making people mad. And I think that ability to make people mad was a source of pleasure for many of his supporters, especially if they felt like the provocation, even if the provocation was deliberate, if they felt the reaction was unjustified or exaggerated, the more they enjoyed it. And I think whether or not it was cruel, whether or not Trump even understood what he was doing, and to be honest, in that particular instance, I'm not sure that Trump understood the significance of Juneteenth or the significance of having the rally at that time. He enjoys provoking people. It's part of how he monopolizes the economy of attention that is so precious in politics. And that, I mean, that was an example of it. And, you know, he will continue to use that skill to keep himself relevant, whether or not he pursues the presidency again.
The book is The Cruelty is the Point. All of you have a copy of it. I'm sure many of you have dived into it already. It's going to be, I think, one of the most important books of the year, and a conversation that you want to be part of. So I hope you all will spend some time reading that over the coming days. I want to say a big thank you to Ta-Nehisi Coates, and also congratulations on your new gig at Howard University. Very excited to hear about that. And of course, to our special guest, Adam Serwer, New York Times bestseller, much deserved. I hope you both are well, and we will hope to talk to you down the road. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all. All right. Take care.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.